Swan Hunter survived 2 world wars, survived the depression that killed palmers of Jarrow and put 80% of a town on the dole, survived nationalisation, privatisation and the collapse of the supertanker market overnight. It didn't survive a single lost contract and a government that had quietly decided the Tyne could do without its shipyards. Today, the 100 acres where 20,000 workers once built the largest ships in Britain is cleared land, marketed for offshore energy, fenced off, silent. The terraced streets where men walk to work at 5:30 in the morning are rubble. The cranes that defined the skyline for a century were dismantled and shipped to India. The receivers took the ship plans, drawings for over 1,600 vessels, and burned them. A yard that built the Mauretania doesn't die of natural causes. Something kills it. A sequence of decisions, each one dressed in the language of necessity, each one removing another piece of what couldn't be rebuilt once it was gone. This is that sequence. And this is what was lost. There's a viewing tower in Wallsend, 34 metres tall. It stands on the site of the old Swan Hunter shipyard canteen, the place where thousands of men ate their dinners, drank their tea, and talked about the ships they were building outside. If you climb to the top on a quiet morning, you can see the whole sweep of the north bank of the Tyne, and what you see is nothing. Flat ground, a cleared site. 32 acres of emptiness where, not so long ago, the largest ships in Britain were assembled. The cranes are gone. Shipped to India in 2007 for £2.5 million, less than the price of a decent house in parts of London. The last 2 hammerhead cranes were brought down by controlled demolition in 2010. The council called it a spectacle for the local community to celebrate the history of shipbuilding on Tyneside. An extraordinary choice of words for an act of destruction. The terraced streets that once ran up to the yard gates have been demolished. The Ship Inn on Gainer's Terrace, the pub where workers climbed the wall for a pint during shifts, closed in 2010, pulled down in 2013. The memorial hall that Sir George Burton Hunter built for the men who didn't come home from the First World War still stands, but the world it was built for has vanished around it. Stand in this place now and listen. What you'll hear is the wind off the river, perhaps a gull, perhaps the hum of traffic on the bypass. What you won't hear, what nobody will ever hear again, is the sound that defined this stretch of the Tyne for over a century. The thunderous, relentless, ear-splitting racket of men building ships. Because this was Swan Hunter, the undisputed king of the River Tyne. The yard that built the Mauretania, the fastest ship in the world, and launched aircraft carriers for the Royal Navy across 2 world wars. At its peak, 20,000 workers clocked in daily across its yards. Immense steel hulls, 10 stories high, rose from the slipways and literally blocked out the sun at the end of residential streets. Children grew up in the shadow of ships so enormous they looked, in Sting's words, like an opera set. Something theatrical and impossible looming behind the back gardens of ordinary terraced houses. It was killed slowly. By competition it didn't see coming. By government decisions that seemed reasonable in committee rooms but landed like a death sentence on the Tyne. By a single lost contract in May 1993 that sent the yard into receivership overnight. And when it was over, when the receivers had shredded the ship plans and burned them, when the last workers had walked out through the gates for the final time, the cranes that had defined the Tyneside skyline for 100 years were taken apart, loaded onto barges and shipped to the other side of the world. This is that story. How it was built, what it was like when it worked, and how it fell. It begins with a man who never lived to see what he'd started. Charles Sheridan Swan was born at Walker, on the north bank of the Tyne, on the 27th of January 1831. His father, William, was a farmer's agent, modest circumstances, but connected to the river through the dense web of family and trade that bound every community along the Tyne to its industries. By 1851, the young Swan was working as a coal engineer. His entry into shipbuilding came not through ambition alone, but through family. In 1854, the prominent Tyne shipbuilder, Dr. Charles Mitchell, married Swan's eldest sister, making Mitchell his brother-in-law and opening a door into one of the most powerful enterprises on the river. Swan proved himself. In 1858, he was trusted enough to supervise the erection of screw steamers on the Volga in Russia, thousands of miles from home, in a foreign country, assembling vessels for a foreign client. It was the kind of work that tested a man's competence utterly. No shortcuts, no excuses, no one to lean on. He came back with a reputation. In 1874, when a joint venture at a Wallsend shipyard collapsed, Mitchell took over the site and placed Swan in charge. It became CS Swan & Co. A small yard on the north bank, a few acres, a handful of berths, and the beginning of everything that followed. Swan didn't live to see any of it. On the 26th of April, 1879, returning from the continent aboard a steamer, he fell from the bows and was struck by the paddle wheel. He was 48 years old. His son, Charles Sheraton Swan, born in St. Petersburg during one of his father's Russian assignments, was only 9. The boy would eventually serve his apprenticeship, join the company, rise to director by 1903, vice chairman, chairman, and a knighthood. But all of that was decades away. In the spring of 1879, there was only a widow, a fatherless child, and an unfinished arrangement. Because before his death, Swan had been negotiating a partnership with a man from the other side of the river, a man who would take what Swan had started and turn it into something extraordinary. George Burton Hunter was born in Sunderland on the 19th of December, 1845, the third son of a shipowner, raised in the world of yards and keels and river commerce. He'd apprenticed with his cousin William Pyle in Sunderland, then moved to the Clyde to work for R. Napier and Sons, one of the finest marine engineering firms in Scotland, before returning to Wareside in 1873 to form a partnership with S.P. Austin. He'd earned a reputation as a formidable shipbuilder, technically brilliant, commercially shrewd, and by all accounts a fair employer. Company records describe him as a man of outstanding technical and commercial ability, whose interests extended far beyond his professional life. He married Annie Hudson, daughter of a Whitby merchant and niece of the railway magnate George Hudson. When Swan died, Hunter didn't walk away. He negotiated with Charles Mitchell and H.F. Swan, Charles Sheridan's brother, who brokered a new arrangement with Mary Swan, the widow. Hunter was installed as managing director. In 1880, the firm was refounded as C.S. Swan & Hunter. Hunter inherited a yard at Wallsend covering less than 7 acres, with a river frontage of less than 100 yards. It was modest. It was a beginning. And Hunter, with the particular single-mindedness of a man who understood exactly what the Tyne could produce if properly managed, set about transforming it. By 1883, he'd acquired an adjoining 16-acre chemical works site, creating the East Yard. Total acreage, 23 acres, 6 building berths. By 1893, barely 13 years after the partnership was founded, Swan Hunter had become the largest shipbuilder on Tyneside, in terms of tonnage. Hunter would become mayor of Wallsend. He'd be knighted in 1918. He acquired Wallsend Hall in 1914 and gifted it to the town 5 years later. It became the Sir G. B. Hunter Memorial Hospital. He died at Jesmond, Newcastle, in 1937, aged 91, having watched the yard he'd built survive one world war, a global depression, and the first tremors of the competition that would eventually destroy it. But that was all to come. In the 1890s, the Tyne was the centre of the shipbuilding world, and Hunter's yard was about to take on the contract that would make its name known across every ocean on Earth. To understand what Swan Hunter became, you need to understand what the world looked like at the turn of the 20th century. Britain built ships. That's what it did. At the start of the 1900s, almost half of the world's ships were being constructed in the northeast of England, across the Blyth, Tyne, Wear, and Tees rivers. By the 1890s, British yards were delivering roughly 80% of all shipping tonnage worldwide. The Tyne alone was home to dozens of yards on both banks: Armstrong Whitworth at Elswick, Palmer's at Jarrow, Hawthorne Leslie at Hebburn, Reedhead's at South Shields. The river bristled with cranes. The air rang with riveting. And at the centre of it all was Wallsend. Swan Hunter had already proven itself. SS Milwaukee in 1896. At 7,323 gross register tons, the largest cargo steamer then afloat. SS Monarch the following year, immediately breaking the record. And then, in 1902, the vessel that first brought fame beyond the industry, RMS Carpathia, built for Cunard. Carpathia became immortal, not for what she was, but for what she did, racing through the North Atlantic ice field on the night of the 15th of April, 1912, to rescue 705 survivors from the Titanic. A Swan Hunter ship, saving lives. She was torpedoed and sunk by a German submarine in 1918. Between 1898 and 1903, the yard built 21 ocean liners. But the vessel that transformed Swan Hunter from a successful Tyneside firm into a name known around the world was something else entirely. By 1897, Germany dominated the North Atlantic. The Kaiser Wilhelm der Grosse held the Blue Riband, the unofficial prize for the fastest Atlantic crossing, and J.P. Morgan's International Mercantile Marine was buying up shipping lines, including White Star. Britain's grip on the seas was slipping. Cunard and the British government struck a deal, a loan of £2,600,000 at low interest over 20 years, plus an annual mail subsidy of £150,000 to build 2 superliners capable of conversion to armed merchant cruisers in wartime. Britain was buying its naval insurance with passenger ships. And the contract to build one of them, the one that would prove the faster, the more beloved, the more enduring in memory, came to Wallsend. To win that contract, Swan Hunter merged. On the 15th of June, 1903, the firm joined with Wigham Richardson and the Tyne Pontoons and Dry Docks Company to form Swan, Hunter and Wigham Richardson Limited. The merger was specifically engineered to secure the Mauretania contract. The combined company had initial share capital of £1.5 million and covered approximately 78 acres with 4,000 feet of unbroken river frontage. John Wigham Richardson, whose Neptune works at Low Walker joined the merger, was the son of Quakers from Newcastle. He'd founded his yard in 1860 with less than £5,000 from his father, a 4-acre site with 3 berths and 200 workers. It was one of the world's first yards to build ships in steel. Richardson's pacifism meant the Neptune works had never tendered for Admiralty contracts. That changed with the merger. Richardson became chairman of the combined company until his death in 1908. There was another piece of the puzzle, and it was pure Tyneside, Charles Algernon. Parsons had patented the first steam turbine on the Tyne in 1884. In 1894, he'd built Turbinia at Wallsend, the first turbine-powered vessel capable of 35 knots. At Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee Fleet Review at Spithead in 1897, Parsons famously gate-crashed by racing Turbinia between the assembled warships of the Royal Navy, demonstrating, with characteristic Tyneside directness, that this new technology could outrun anything afloat. Swan Hunter's acquisition of the Wallsend Slipway and Engineering Company, a licensed Parsons turbine manufacturer, was specifically to build Mauretania's turbines in-house. The leap from the largest previous marine turbine at 8,000 shaft horsepower to Mauretania's 68,000 was described as requiring the greatest courage from Parsons. Everything was in place. The keel was laid on the 18th of August, 1904. Yard number 735. RMS Mauretania, 790 feet long, 88 feet across the beam, 31,938 gross register tons, 8 decks, 4 funnels, quadruple screw Parsons, steam turbines producing 68,000 shaft horsepower, later increased to 90,000, 23 double-ended and 2 single-ended Scotch boilers, capacity for 2,165 passengers and a crew of 802. Approximately 3,000 workers laboured on her construction over roughly 2 years. She was, at the time of her building, the largest moving structure ever created by human hands. They built her under custom glass-roofed sheds, 750 feet long, with 7 overhead electric cranes, an innovation that allowed work to continue through the Tyneside reign. On the 20th of September 1906, she was launched by the Duchess of Roxburgh before vast crowds. Her hull was painted light grey for the photographs. When she finally left the Tyne in October 1907 after fitting out, she departed to the shrieking of ships' sirens and the applause of thousands of spectators lining both banks. She captured the eastbound Blue Riband on her maiden return voyage in December 1907, averaging 23.69 knots. She took the westbound record in September 1909, and she held them, for approximately 20 years, until the German liner Bremen took the westbound in 1929. Remarkably, in August of that same year, aged 22 and supposedly past her prime, she made the fastest passage of her entire career. New York to Plymouth at an average of 27.22 knots. She simply refused to slow down. When she was finally scrapped at Rosyth in 1935, she stopped at her Tyne birthplace for half an hour, drawing crowds of sightseers. The Lord Mayor of Newcastle boarded, and then came the telegram. From the small Northumberland port of Amble, just up the coast. Still the finest ship on the seas. Mauretania replied, "To the last and kindliest port in England, greetings and thanks." Swan Hunter had broken the world tonnage record in 1906 and again in 1907. Between 1910 and 1913, the firm had the largest output of any shipbuilding business in the world. In 1912 alone, it launched 21 ships with a combined tonnage exceeding 126,000 tons. But those were peacetime records. Within 2 years, the yard would be building for a different purpose entirely. During the First World War, Swan Hunter produced over 100 warships and 230 other vessels, destroyers, sloops, submarines, monitors. By 1920, 10,000 people worked across a 100-acre site. And then came the Second War. The yard's contribution was immense. Battleship HMS Anson, 42,000 tons, armed with 10 14-inch guns, escorting Arctic convoys and covering the strike on the Tirpitz. HMS Edinburgh, a town-class cruiser launched in 1938, sunk in the Arctic in May 1942 while carrying 465 gold ingots, 4.5 tons of Soviet bullion, in what became the most famous salvage operation of the 20th century when 431 bars were recovered from the seabed in 1981. 5 cruisers, approximately 30 destroyers and escorts, aircraft carriers, 55 merchant vessels under government licence. Over the yard's entire history, more than 1,600 ships launched from its slipways, including over 400 naval vessels. And then, in the years after the war, Swan Hunter grew again, absorbed its neighbours, became something vast. Imagine it. It's a winter morning, 5:30, still dark. You're up before the alarm because your body knows the routine, the same routine your father kept, and his father before him. Cup of tea, slice of toast. Out the door and down the terraced street, collar up against the Tyneside cold, boots on the cobbles, joining the stream of men moving in the same direction. Thousands of them, all heading the same way. Past the corner shop, past the working men's club, past the chapel. Down the bank toward the river, toward the gates, toward the yard. And then you see it. The yard sprawled across 100 acres of the north bank. 3 main sites ran along the great bend of the Tyne, the Neptune Works nearest Newcastle, at Walker, the dry docks department in the middle, and the Wallsend shipyard at the eastern end. Branches of the North Eastern Railway ran into and through the whole of the works, connecting them to local collieries and steelworks. The Wallsend yard had 6 building berths, 2 of them covered with enormous sheds and electric gantry cranes, an innovation that kept work going through the worst of the weather. There was a dry dock 550 feet long, 2 floating docks, and fabrication sheds described by workers who knew them as 4 or 5 football pitches in size. The drawing office, the mould loft, the plate shops, the machine shops, the joinery. The machine shop at the Neptune Yard alone employed between 350 and 400 fitters and millwrights. And everywhere, on the berths, rising above the sheds and the cranes and the rooftops of the houses beyond, the ships. Towering, impossible structures of steel, hulls so large that if you stood at the base, the sky disappeared. Bill Cockcroft, who would become the last employee of Swan Hunter, remembered his first day. Walking down the bank to where I was going to work, I got the biggest fright of my life when I saw one of the supertankers on the berth. It actually blocked the light out in the yard. Sting, who grew up on Gerald Street, a street that led directly down to the yard, recalled it differently, but the awe was the same. I was born in the shadow of that shipyard, literally. You look at the pictures of my street, and then this huge, looked like an opera set behind, gigantic ships. There's something very theatrical about it. Theatrical is exactly the word. The Victorian terraced houses, 2 stories, 6 or 7 metres high, ran right up to the yard gates, and behind them, rising like a cliff face of riveted steel, the hulls of vessels that weighed 250,000 tons. The photographer Chris Killip captured it in his iconic image from the mid-1970s. A narrow street of low brick houses, children on the pavement, and at the end of the street, filling the entire sky, the black hull of the supertanker Tyne Pride. It was, someone later wrote, absurd in the way that a Dali or Magritte painting is. The surreal scale of industry pressing up against the intimate scale of domestic life. The buzzer sounded at 7:30. When it went, the roller shutter came down. Latecomers, and there were always latecomers, would sprint down the bank and roll under the door to avoid losing 1/4 of an hour's pay. If you were late after 7:45, you lost half an hour, late after 8 o'clock, and you'd be sent home until after lunch. The average working week before January 1919 had been 54 hours. After that, 47. Employment was essentially casualised. You could be let go at a day's notice, sometimes an hour's. The trades formed a hierarchy as rigid as any medieval guild. At the apex of the hull, trades were the platers, the highest paid, the most respected. Then the riveting squads, a rivet heater, a catcher, usually a boy, a holder-on, and a riveter. Some squads had both a left-handed and a right-handed riveter who struck alternating blows. The sound, everyone agreed, was like standing next to a machine gun. Caulkers made the joints watertight. Shipwrights had the critical job of driving out the keel blocks before launching. Get it wrong and the ship wouldn't move. Get it catastrophically wrong and men could die. Welders, burners, drillers, crane drivers, draftsmen, loftsmen, fitters, electricians, plumbers, painters, riggers, joiners, blacksmiths. Anglesmiths, boat builders, boiler makers, brass finishers, cabinet makers, countersinkers, French polishers, furnace men, pattern makers, sail makers, sheet metal men, toolsmiths, winchmen. Dozens of trades, each with its own skills, its own union, its own fierce sense of jurisdiction. Demarcation disputes, arguments about which trade had the right to which job, were constant. There were approximately 27 trade unions active in British shipbuilding by 1912. The noise was horrendous. Inside the fabrication sheds, overhead cranes, hammering, drilling, welding. A wall of sound that never relented. On the berths, the riveting squads kept up their machine gun rhythm from morning until the buzzer sounded. No hard hats, no overalls, no steel toe cap boots. You just had whatever you had on that day, workers recalled. Men walked under vessels being constructed while welders and caulkers worked above with sparks and fragments raining down. Industrial deafness wasn't recognised as a genuine injury until 1977, and the asbestos, used extensively in insulation and fireproofing from the 1930s through the 70s. That was the slow killer nobody talked about until it was decades too late. North Tyneside would eventually rank 3rd worst in England and Wales for mesothelioma deaths. The long latency period, 20 to 50 years, meant men exposed in the 60s and 70s continued dying well into the 2000s. But that knowledge was in the future. In the years when the yard was full and the order book was thick, what the men who worked there felt, overwhelmingly, was pride. Pay came through a complex system of time rates, piecework, and bonuses. Riveting squads were paid per 100 rivets deposited. On payday, women queued at the top of the bank to collect housekeeping money before their husbands reached the Coronation pub. Because once they got to the pub, that was it, all gone. Bookies runners operated illegally inside the yard itself, collecting bets on the horses. There was an economy within the economy, a world within the world. Families didn't just work at Swan Hunter, they belonged to it. Multi-generational employment was the norm, not the exception. Fathers brought sons as apprentices. Brothers worked alongside brothers. Cockcroft remembered. In my office, they had a guy whose wife, his mother, and his father all worked there as well, because it was such a family institution. E. John Hunter, grandson of the founder George Burton Hunter himself, became chairman in 1957. A parliamentary survey in 1983 showed 62% of the Wallsend workforce lived in Wallsend or adjacent towns. At nearby yards, 37% lived within a mile. The communities were described in Parliament as closely knit, like pit villages. Shipbuilding accounted for 44% of male unemployment in Wallsend during downturns, because when the yard contracted, there was almost nowhere else to go. And the yard was the town. Wallsend, the name itself marking the spot where Hadrian's Wall met the river 1900 years ago. The Roman fort Segedunum, sitting just behind the shipyard site, had been overwritten by industry. The Victorian terraced houses were built in the 1880s for shipyard workers. The Memorial Hall, commissioned by Hunter at a cost of £25,000, opened in 1925, dedicated to the yard workers who fell in the First World War, with a ballroom for 1,200. The Wallsend Ex-Service and Working Men's Club on Station Road, established in 1918. The pubs, the churches, the corner shops, all of it sustained by the wage packets that came out of those gates on a Friday. During the wars, the workforce changed. In March 1941, Ernest Bevin called for 100,000 women to join the shipbuilding industry. Women worked as welders, rivet catchers, drillers. Lily Errington recalled drilling hundreds of holes. She was the last woman to leave after the war ended, pushed out, as they were everywhere, to make way for the returning men. Every yard had its characters. Cockcroft was nicknamed Poison Pen for marking late time cards. An old sweeper-up was known as Pot Pie. The welder Jack Davitt, pen name Ripyard Cuddling, wrote poetry from the shop floor, published as Shipyard Muddling in the 1970s. Apprentices were sent for skyhooks and tartan paint, non-existent items, and came back to laughter they'd one day inflict on the next generation of boys. And then there were the launches. A launch day was the biggest day the yard knew. VIPs did the honours. The band played. The area by the slipway was decorated with streamers and flags. Officially, workers weren't allowed to stop and watch, but thousands did, and a blind eye was turned. Schools issued special pink leave of absence forms. Local railway stations became a seething mass of people, and express trains that normally didn't stop were halted to clear the crowds. The physical sensation was unforgettable. At first it didn't seem to move, one worker recalled. Then slowly it started to slip away, and the enormous chains started to take the strain with an almighty rushing sound sending up a huge cloud of dust. There was always great debate about whether the chains would hold, whether the ship would stop in the river or carry straight on and hit the opposite bank. When SO Northumbria launched, she sent a wave crashing onto the south shore. When she left the Tyne on the 8th of February 1970, over 250,000 spectators blocked every road leading to the river. That was Swan Hunter. That was Wallsend. A place where the rhythm of daily life was set by the works hooter, where the ships towered above the rooftops like cathedrals of steel, where whole families lived and worked and grew old inside the same few streets and the same vast yard. Following the Geddes report of 1966, which recommended consolidating Britain's fragmented shipbuilding industry into regional groups, Swan Hunter absorbed yard after yard along the Tyne. Smith's Dock, Cleland's at Willington Quay, John Reedhead and Sons at South Shields, the Vickers Armstrong Naval Yard at High Walker, Hawthorne Leslie at Hebburn. By the 1st of January 1968, Swan Hunter and Tyne Shipbuilders was the largest shipbuilding group in Britain, controlling 1/3 of all British shipbuilding and repairing capacity. 20,000 employees. The order book was full. The supertanker era was booming. Between 1969 and 1977, the yard would build 8 of these colossal vessels: Esso Northumbria, Esso Hibernia, Texaco Great Britain, London Lion, World Unicorn, Windsor Lion, Tyne Pride, Everett F. Wells. Ships so enormous that a portion of the opposite riverbank had to be cut away to accommodate their bulk. Esso Northumbria alone was 1,143 feet long, 170 feet in the beam, 253,000 deadweight tons. The captain reportedly needed a bicycle to get around the decks. Her crew numbered just 31, a staggering level of automation for the time. The old berths had been demolished and replaced with a single massive berth capable of building vessels of 250,000 tons and over 1,000 feet in length. New 180-ton cranes towered over the works. The investment was enormous. The confidence was absolute. In 1968, HMS Sheffield and HMS Coventry were on the books. Type 42 destroyers that would see action in the Falklands. Aircraft carriers, HMS Illustrious and HMS Ark Royal were being planned. The yard had just launched the first British-built supertanker. The post-war carriers and cruisers had cemented its reputation with the Admiralty. It was building warships and merchant vessels simultaneously for clients around the world at a scale that dwarfed anything in its century-long history. The absolute summit. 20,000 men streaming through the gates, the largest ships ever built in Britain rising from the berths. 1/3 of the nation's shipbuilding capacity under one name. The Tyne roaring with the sound of steel being shaped, riveted, welded, launched into the grey water to the cheers of hundreds of thousands. And standing at that height, looking out across 100 acres of industry that seemed as permanent as the river itself, nobody inside those walls could see what was coming. The competition building purpose-designed yards in Yokohama and Ulsan. The oil shock that would vaporise the tanker market overnight. The political decisions, nationalisation, privatisation, the warship-only designation, that would strip the yard of its ability to compete. The single lost contract that would end everything. The seeds of decline were already in the ground, they just hadn't broken the surface yet. The strange thing about decline is how long you can ignore it when the order book is full. In 1956, while Swan Hunter was still building cruisers and carriers for the Royal Navy, while the Tyne still rang with the sound of steel on steel, Japan quietly overtook Britain as the world's largest shipbuilding nation. Its share that year was just over 22%. By 1965, it was nearly 44%. By 1970, it commanded half the world's output. Britain's share, meanwhile, was in freefall, from roughly 80% in the 1890s to 60% before the First World War, to 17% by 1957, to 7.5% by 1966, to below 5% by the 70s. By the 90s, it would be less than 1%. The numbers are stark enough, but the reasons behind them tell a story that goes beyond simple competition. Japanese yards were purpose-built. New facilities designed from scratch for the era of the supertanker, building docks rather than slipways, prefabricated block construction rather than the plate-by-plate methods that British yards still used. Their build time for a cargo ship fell from 10 months in the late 1940s to approximately 3 months by 1970, even as the ships themselves grew 10 times larger. They offered fixed-price contracts and shorter delivery times. Their labour costs were a fraction of Britain's. Their governments backed them with investment and subsidy on a scale that no British administration was willing to match. And then came South Korea. From virtually nothing in the 1970s, the country built a shipbuilding industry that would command nearly 40% of global production by the early 2000s. The big three, Hyundai Heavy Industries, Daewoo Shipbuilding, Samsung Heavy Industries, were created with massive state support. Cheap land, cheap credit, guaranteed orders. Purpose-built mega yards on greenfield coastal sites, with building docks large enough to assemble the biggest vessels afloat. British yards, by contrast, were described by their own government reports as under-equipped, retaining fixed cranes, manually operated derricks, and pushcarts on rails. Swan Hunter had invested in new facilities for its supertanker berth, but it was modernising within the constraints of a Victorian-era site on the north bank of the Tyne, hemmed in by terraced streets and railway lines. The Japanese and Koreans had no such constraints. They built for the future on empty land. The British were trying to retrofit the past. Between 1950 and 1975, during one of the largest shipbuilding booms in history, a period when global demand for new tonnage was insatiable, the United Kingdom was the only major shipbuilding country that did not increase its output at all. Not a decline in market share, but an actual failure to grow during a boom. The world was ordering more ships than ever before, and Britain simply couldn't keep pace. And then the boom ended. On the 6th of October, 1973, Egypt and Syria launched a coordinated attack on Israel. The Yom Kippur War lasted less than 3 weeks, but its economic consequences lasted a generation. The OPEC oil embargo quadrupled oil prices virtually overnight. New building orders worldwide plummeted from 72.8 million gross tons in 1973 to 13.8 million in 1975, an 81% collapse in 2 years. By early 1976, over 100 million deadweight tons of tanker tonnage, nearly a fifth of the entire global fleet, was laid up, idle, rusting at anchor. Ships that had been built only a decade earlier went straight from the yard to the breaker's beach. Swan Hunter, which had just completed 8 supertankers and invested millions in the berths and cranes to build them, watched its order book evaporate. The great tanker berth that had launched SO Northumbria and Tyne Pride, the berth that represented the future, was suddenly a monument to a market that no longer existed. It's easy, in hindsight, to see the pattern. But hindsight is a privilege the people living through it didn't have. In 1973, the yard was full. The cranes were turning. 20,000 men were earning a wage. The idea that all of this could simply stop, that the demand for ships could collapse so completely, so quickly, would have seemed absurd. It didn't seem absurd for long. The Geddes Report of 1966 had been the first attempt at a cure. Chaired by Ray Geddes, managing director of Dunlop Rubber, the report recommended consolidating Britain's fragmented yards into regional supergroupings and offered modernisation grants totalling £37.6 million. Swan Hunter had followed the prescription dutifully, absorbing yards up and down the Tyne. But Geddes contained a fatal misjudgment. It opposed the creation of large modern shipyards based on building docks, the very method that was transforming Japanese and Korean output, as too expensive. It made no mention of Japan other than a passing reference to labour costs. The target was for Britain to reclaim 12.5% of the world market. It was never achieved. The report was treating a cancer with aspirin. Then came nationalisation. The Aircraft and Shipbuilding Industries Act of 1977 created British shipbuilders, formally vested on the 1st of July that year. 27 major companies, 32 shipyards, 6 marine engine works, 6 general engineering plants. It controlled 97% of UK merchant shipbuilding capacity and 100% of warship capacity. Swan Hunter entered nationalisation with 11,000 employees. Peter Milne, Swan Hunter's managing director, would later reflect, "The strength of Swan Hunter was volume of output and technical capability. We remained profitable up to nationalisation." He wasn't exaggerating. The yard had been making money. The timing of nationalisation was catastrophic. By 1978, 75% of the world's shipbuilding berths were empty. The government had taken control of the industry at the precise moment when there was almost no industry left to control. By the end of 1982, British shipbuilders had closed half its shipyards to reduce overcapacity. The medicine was killing the patient. And then the treatment changed again. Privatisation. Swan Hunter was sold back to its management in 1986 via a buyout under the British Shipbuilders Act, 1983. Employment stood at 4,500, less than a quarter of its peak. The Neptune Yard, the historic Walker site that John Wigham Richardson had founded with £5,000 and 200 workers in 1860, was closed in 1988. But the privatisation came with a condition that would prove fatal. Swan Hunter was redesignated as a warship builder only. The logic was administrative. Merchant shipbuilding and warship construction were being handled differently in the wind-down of British shipbuilders. But the consequence was devastating. As a warship-only yard, Swan Hunter was excluded from the European Economic Community subsidies available to merchant shipbuilders. It could no longer compete for the commercial contracts that might have sustained it between naval orders. Its survival now depended entirely on winning Ministry of Defence contracts. And in an era of shrinking defence budgets, that was a dangerously narrow lifeline. Peter Milne saw it clearly. The survival of shipbuilding capacity became a question of political will. Countries like Italy, Spain, and West Germany believed that shipbuilding was an important part of their maritime infrastructure and have kept fairly substantial shipbuilding capacity. Britain did not make that choice. Japan invested in rationalisation. South Korea provided massive state backing. Germany maintained yards through co-determination. No British government, Conservative or Labour, demonstrated the political will to sustain the industry in the way that competitor nations did. The yard was still building. HMS Illustrious, keel laid in October 1976, launched in December 1978 by Princess Margaret, had her construction accelerated by 3 months when the Falklands War erupted. She was commissioned at sea in June 1982 and would serve 32 years, the longest-serving ship in the active fleet, at her retirement in 2014. HMS Ark Royal. Keel laid December 1978, launched June 1981 by the Queen Mother. Was originally to have been named HMS Indomitable, but was renamed due to public sentiment. Type 23 frigates followed: HMS Westminster, HMS Northumberland, HMS Richmond. These were fine ships, complex, capable warships that served the Royal Navy with distinction. But each one took years to build, employed fewer workers than the supertankers had, and depended on a single customer, a customer who was under no obligation to keep ordering from the Tyne. By the early 1990s, Swan Hunter's survival rested on winning the next contract. Just one more order, just enough to keep the gates open, the skills alive, the community intact. In May 1993, they lost it. 2 yards bid for the contract to build a new landing platform helicopter for the Royal Navy. Swan Hunter, on the Tyne, bid £210.6 million. VSEL, Vickers Shipbuilding and Engineering Limited, at Barrow-in-Furness, bid £139.5 million. A gap of £71 million. VSEL's approach was radical. They subcontracted the hull construction to Caverna Govan, a commercial yard on the Clyde, treating the ship essentially as a merchant vessel fitted with military hardware. Swan Hunter had treated it as a fully military build. Different standards, different costs, different price. On the 11th of May, 1993, the government awarded the contract to VSEL. The ship became HMS Ocean. Her ultimate cost was approximately £154 million, more than $50 million above VSEL's original bid. Whether that vindicated Swan Hunter's pricing or simply reflected the usual escalation of military procurement depends on who you ask. What is beyond dispute is the consequence. There was a false dawn. On the morning of the announcement, Neville Trotter, Conservative MP for Tynemouth, had indicated that Swan Hunter had won. The Evening Chronicle ran the headline, "Victory." Then the Commons announcement came. The papers were pulled from the stands. 2 days later, on the 13th of May, Swan Hunter went into receivership. The receivers were Price Waterhouse. Bill Cockcroft remembered the moment precisely. That was going along swimmingly until 1:31 p.m. on the 13th May 1993, when Roger Vaughan announced that we were going into receivership. Vaughan, the managing director, stood on one of the drawing office tables so that he could address everybody. "If I remember correctly," Cockcroft said, "it rained for 3 days and somebody said that it was God crying because swans had shut." On the 28th of May, a fortnight later, 400 staff were summarily dismissed without consultation. A Newcastle industrial tribunal would later find it difficult to imagine a more clear-cut default. But since the company was insolvent, workers received little or nothing. The highest award was £1,640. For some men, that was the sum total of what they received for decades of service. In Parliament, the reaction was raw. Stephen Byers, MP for Wallsend, the constituency that existed because of the yard, spoke of "the sense of despair and disappointment felt yesterday on Tyneside will turn today to anger and a sense of betrayal." Robin Cook warned, "Already in the shipbuilding yards on both banks of the Tyne, 1 in 3 men is out of work. If Swan Hunter closes, 1 in 2 could be on the dole." Tim Sainsbury, the minister, offered enterprise zones and spoke, revealingly, of transitioning from excessive dependence upon the old industries of coal, shipbuilding and steel. The language of managed decline. The language of an industry that had been quietly written off. Swan Hunter also had an unpaid £20 million claim against the Ministry of Defence for prior work. It went unpaid. And then came something that is difficult to write about without anger, though the eulogist's job is to describe, not to prosecute. Under the receiver's instructions, the plans for all ships no longer afloat were taken from their storage tubes. Over a century of shipbuilding heritage, the drawings of hundreds of vessels, the technical record of everything Swan Hunter had built and learned and perfected, and they were shredded and burned. A man from Tyne and Wear archives arrived with a van and rescued what he could. A fraction was saved. The rest was destroyed. Total job losses from the 1993 receivership, approximately 6,000 direct Tyneside jobs, plus substantial losses in the supply chain. The steel suppliers, the electrical contractors, the specialist firms that had existed to serve the yards. An academic study confirmed the complex but generally negative effect of redundancy on the workers involved. A 1979 survey of earlier Swan Hunter redundancies had shown that 83% of those made redundant had not found employment after a year. Their skills, hard-won, specific, irreplaceable, were of limited value outside an industry that was dying. Shipbuilding accounted for 44% of male unemployment in Wallsend during downturns. And this wasn't a downturn. This was the end. It wasn't quite the end. Not yet. In July 1995, a Dutch millionaire named Jaap Kroos of the THC Group bought the Wallsend yard from receivership. The company began trading as Swan Hunter Tyneside Limited in January 1996. Kroos personally lived in a flat on the site, a detail that says something about the man's commitment, or perhaps his stubbornness. In 1997 and 1998, the yard converted the bulk carrier Solitaire into the world's largest pipe-laying vessel, temporarily employing approximately 2,000 workers. The gates were open again. The lights were on. It looked for a moment like something had been saved. On the 18th of December 2000, Swan Hunter was awarded a £210 million contract for 2 Bay-class landing ship dock vessels, RFA Largs Bay and RFA Lime Bay. Construction began on the 28th of January 2002. It was the largest naval order the yard had received in years. It should have been the lifeline. It became the final blow. The project was plagued from the start. Only 7% of design drawings were provided on time. More than 52% arrived over a year late. Crows blamed the Ministry of Defence for constant specification changes. "We didn't have any experience with the MOD. They just kept changing and changing and changing." But the deeper problem was one that no contract could fix. The yard had lost its experienced workforce during the 1993 receivership. The men who knew how to build warships, the platers, the welders, the fitters, the draftsmen who carried decades of accumulated knowledge, had scattered. Some had retired, some had retrained, some had simply never worked again. Rebuilding that pool of skill proved extraordinarily difficult. You can reopen a yard, you can rehire workers, but you can't recreate overnight the institutional knowledge that took a century to accumulate. Costs spiralled. By July 2006, the contract was cancelled. RFA Largs Bay, launched in July 2003, was completed and entered service in December 2006. She was the last ship fully built and finished by Swan Hunter. She would later be sold to the Royal Australian Navy. RFA Lime Bay, launched in September 2005, was not so fortunate. Still incomplete, she was towed from the Tyne to BAE Systems at Govan on the Clyde. The image of that tow, an unfinished warship being pulled away from the yard that bore the name Swan Hunter, heading for a Scottish yard to be completed by someone else, was the final indignity. 800 workers lost their jobs. The total programme cost told its own story. Swan Hunter was paid £342 million. BAE received £254 million. A total of £596 million for 4 ships originally estimated at £420 million. The yard that had built the Mauretania on budget and the fastest ship in the world couldn't complete a landing ship dock on time or on cost. Not because the workers were less skilled or less willing, but because the skills themselves had been destroyed in the receivership 13 years earlier, and you cannot rebuild in 5 years what took 100 to create. In November 2006, Crows announced the business was effectively finished. He reflected, "I have no regrets. We kept the yard open for 12 years, we employed lots of people, we trained 300 young apprentices." He died in 2016. Whatever else can be said about the Bay-class debacle, Crows had risked his own money on a place that his own country's government had given up on. RFA Lime Bay, the last ship to enter the water on the Tyne, was technically the final vessel. Not completed. Not finished. Towed away incomplete. From the Mauretania to the Lime Bay. From the blue riband holder to an unfinished hull pulled to Scotland. A century of shipbuilding, and that was how it ended. In April 2007, the cranes came down. They were sold, along with the floating dock and all remaining equipment, to Bharati Shipyards, India's second largest private sector shipbuilder, for an estimated £2.5 million. Of the 11 cranes on the site, Bharati wanted only 3 of the larger ones for reuse. The remaining 8 were scrapped where they stood. The contractor, O'Brien's, dismantled them all. The 3 reusable cranes were cut into sections, loaded onto a floating dry dock using self-propelled modular transporters, and carried to India aboard a semi-submersible, heavy-lift ship. 6 shipments over 6 months. 6. The 6th and final consignment left the port of Tyne on the 4th of April 2009. The last 2 giant hammerhead cranes, the ones that had defined the Wallsend skyline, that had been visible from miles upriver and down, that workers' children had grown up seeing from their bedroom windows, were demolished by controlled explosive collapse in 2010. The local council described the demolition as a spectacle for the local community to celebrate the history of shipbuilding on Tyneside. Celebrate. As if bringing down the last physical evidence of a century of work was something to mark with bunting and applause. The workers who remained after the final closure faced what workers from Swan Hunter had always faced when the yard contracted. Except this time, there was no prospect of the yard reopening. The 1979 study of earlier redundancies had been blunt. 83% of those made redundant hadn't found new employment within a year. Retraining schemes were offered, but their effectiveness was limited. The skills of a shipyard plater or a marine draftsman didn't translate easily to the service economy that was supposed to replace what had been lost. And then there was the asbestos. The slow poison that had been packed into every ship the yard built from the 1930s through the 70s, lagging, insulation, fireproofing, continued its work long after the last ship launched. North Tyneside ranked third worst in England and Wales for mesothelioma deaths, with a rate of 10.9 per 100,000 between 2010 and 2014. The long latency period, 20 to 50 years between exposure and diagnosis, meant that former Swan Hunter workers who'd breathed in the fibres during the boom years of the 60s and 70s were still being diagnosed, still dying, well into the 2020s. Approximately 5,000 asbestos-related deaths occur in the United Kingdom every year, with shipbuilders among the highest risk groups. The yard didn't just close, it continued to kill, decades after the gates shut for the last time. The former Swan Hunter site covers 12.94 hectares, approximately 32 acres, on the north bank of the Tyne. In 2019, North Tyneside Council agreed to sell it to Shepherd Offshore, a company developing it for offshore wind, energy and advanced manufacturing under the name Neptune Energy Park. A £1.9 million centre for innovation houses 8 businesses. There are wet berths, quays, access roads. Swan Hunter itself continues to exist, as a design engineering and equipment rental company with approximately 200 staff. 200, where 20,000 once worked. The cranes are gone. The shipbuilding halls are gone. The slipways are gone. The terraced streets that ran up to the yard gates are gone. The ship-in is gone. The skyline that once bristled with steel is flat. The sound of riveting, that machine gun rhythm that rattled windows and defined the working day for generations, has been replaced by the wind off the river and, if you listen carefully, the calls of kittiwakes nesting on the Tyne Bridge. Because the river has changed too. In 1960, not a single salmon was recorded as caught on the Tyne. The river was ecologically dead, poisoned by a century of industrial discharge, shipyard waste, coal dust, chemical runoff. Today, it is the most prolific salmon river in England and Wales, with over 30,000 fish passing the counter at Riding Mill in a good year. Seals swim as far upriver as Wylam. The kittiwakes, roughly 800 to 1,000 breeding pairs, form one of the most unusual urban seabird colonies in the world. The regenerated waterfront tells its own story. The Gateshead Millennium Bridge, the world's first tilting bridge, opened in 2001, nicknamed the Blinking Eye. The Baltic Centre for Contemporary Art, housed in the former Baltic flour mills. An industrial building that opened in 1950 and closed after a fire in 1976, now a world-class gallery. The Glass House, designed by Foster and Partners, home to the Royal Northern Sinfonia. A flour mill converted to an art gallery. A river that ran black now running with salmon. The sound of riveting replaced by the sound of kittiwakes. The visual language of Tyneside has been completely rewritten. Whether that's progress or loss depends on where you were standing when the cranes came down. The Segedunum Roman Fort, Baths and Museum, opened in June 2000, stands immediately adjacent to the former yard. The museum building itself was the Swan Hunter Shipyard Canteen, built in 1943. Its 34-metre viewing tower offers panoramic views across the excavated Roman fort and the empty ground where ships once towered. A 2024 community consultation found that 85% of residents wanted a gallery exploring local history, including the Swan Hunter shipyards. The Discovery Museum in Newcastle houses a 16-foot builder's model of RMS Mauretania in its Tyneside Challenge Gallery, alongside Parsons' Turbinia. A mahogany pilaster from Mauretania's first-class lounge sits on display at the Segedunum Annex, yards from where she was built. On the 1st of May, 2006, with the yard in its final months, Neil Tennant and Chris Lowe of the Pet Shop Boys performed their score for Eisenstein's battleship Potemkin at the Swan Hunter shipyard before an audience of 14,000. Tennant, a Geordie himself, born in North Shields, understood the resonance. Free Tickets, a film about a battleship played in a dying shipyard on the river where battleships had once been built. Sting's The Last Ship album, Broadway musical, UK tour remains the most prominent cultural expression of what was lost. Set in Wallsend, it tells the story of a shipyard community facing closure. Chris Killip's photographs from the mid-70s, the terraced streets, the towering hulls, the children playing in the shadow of ships, hang in the Lying Art Gallery. Killip donated the prints in 2017 in honour of all the shipyard workers of Tyneside. He reflected, "Even then I had a sense that all this was not going to last, though I had no idea how soon it would all be gone." Swan Hunter wasn't the only yard to die on the Tyne. It was the last. In the early 1930s, there had been 77 building berths on the river. National Shipbuilders Security Limited, the industry's own demolition body, dismantled almost 40 of them. In 1933, only 2 ships were on the stocks across the entire Tyne. Palmer's of Jarrow, established 1852, 10,000 workers at its peak, closed in 1933. Unemployment in Jarrow soared to approximately 80%. It triggered the Jarrow March of October 1936, 200 men walking nearly 300 miles to London, led by Ellen Wilkinson MP, carrying a petition with over 11,000 signatures. The Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, refused to see them. Armstrong Whitworth at Elswick, Hawthorne Leslie at Hebburn, John Reedhead at South Shields. All gone. Absorbed, closed, demolished. Swan Hunter outlasted them all. Absorbed most of them, in fact. And then followed them into silence. The Tyne's shipbuilding collapse was total. A river that had built nearly half the world's ships at the turn of the century builds none today. The skills that took generations to develop, the ability to read a ship plan and translate it into a 3-dimensional structure of riveted steel, the eye that could spot a flaw in a weld from across a fabrication shed, the instinct for how a hull would behave when it hit the water, all of it gone. Not archived, not preserved, not passed on, gone, destroyed in the receivership, scattered in the redundancies, buried with the men who carried it. What happened at Swan Hunter was not unique. It was the pattern of British deindustrialisation repeated across 1,000 towns. The coal towns, the steel towns, the mill towns, the pottery towns, the car towns. An industry that sustained a community that shaped its identity around that industry. Competition, policy, management failure, global forces, some combination of all of them. And then closure, redundancy, silence, and the long, slow aftermath of trying to build a new life on ground where the old one has been pulled out from under you. But knowing it was part of a pattern doesn't make it less. If anything, it makes it more. 20,000 families. A century of skill. Ships that crossed every ocean, fought in every war, carried passengers and cargo, and the reputation of a nation. All of it concentrated on 100 acres of the north bank of the Tyne, and all of it gone. There's a viewing tower in Wallsend. You can climb it on a quiet morning and look out over flat land and the grey river beyond. Below you, the excavated walls of Sigurdunum, the Roman fort where Hadrian's Wall met the water 1900 years ago. The empire that built that wall thought it would last forever. The industry that replaced it thought the same. In 1935, as the Mauretania was towed to the breaker's yard, she stopped one last time at her birthplace on the Tyne. The small port of Amble sent a telegram. Still the finest ship on the seas. And Mauretania, the ship that had held the blue riband for 20 years, that 3,000 Tyneside men had built with their hands, that had been the fastest vessel afloat and the pride of a river and a nation, sent her reply. To the last and kindliest port in England, greetings and thanks. The machines are silent now. The cranes are in India. The plans are ash. The terraced streets are rubble. The men who built those ships are old or gone. What remains is the river, and the silence, and the memory of what it sounded like when the Tyne still roared.